Greetings. I'm Michelle English, and on behalf of the MIT Center for International Studies, welcome you to today's Starr Forum. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that we have many upcoming Starr Forums and events planned. If you haven't already, please sign up to get our email announcements. In typical fashion, today's talk will conclude with a Q&A with the audience. For those asking questions, please line up behind the mics, and we ask that you can be considerate of time and others who want to ask questions and limit yourself to just one question. Also, we want to make sure, for time's sake, that no personal statements are made as well, and that you would also please identify yourself and your affiliation before asking your question. And please note, if you haven't already, that the MIT Press Bookstore is with us today selling the Compatriots. If you haven't already, please purchase yours today and join the authors on stage after the talk to get your book signed. It's 20% off. Today's Starr Forum is also a part of the Focus on Russia lecture series, co-directed by MIT Professor of History Elizabeth Wood and MIT Scholar and Senior Advisor at the MIT Security Studies Program, Carol Saivetz. Dr. Saivetz will be moderating the Q&A, and Professor Wood will be introducing our guest speakers. Please join me now in welcoming Professor Wood to the podium.
So I'll be very brief. I first met Andrei Soldatov at a conference on intelligence at Harvard last year. I'm very excited. They are Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan are longtime specialists on, let's call it the dark side of Russian politics. They are both investigative journalists, specialists in security studies. They have co-founders and editors of Agentura.ru, which is a Russian website on this topic. They've co-authored a number of books, including the first one, The New Nobility, The Restoration of Russia's Security State, and the KGB. It's one of those top reads in the field. Their second book, also very good, is The Red Web, The Struggle Between Russia's Digital Dictators and the New Online Revolutionaries. And then this most recent book, The Compatriots, The Brutal and Chaotic History of Russia's Exiles, Emigres, and Agents Abroad. And as Michelle said, there will be copies for sale at the conclusion of their talk. So special thanks to Michelle English and Laura Kerwin, who organized this, to John Tierman and Richard Samuels for heading up the Center for International Studies and keeping these things going. There's other things that have been on the monitor for talks, so definitely sign up for other Starr Forum talks if you haven't. And without further ado, Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan. Thank you for coming. Let's welcome them.
Thank you very much for having us and for inviting us to talk about our new book. First, I wanted to say a few words who we are, just to explain things. So we are Moscow-based investigative journalists. Both of us started doing journalism almost simultaneously in 1996. And first we started with something which is quite normal for newcomers, like reporting city activities, city journalism, crime department. I covered IT technologies. But in 1999, we decided to move into the area of security services and counterterrorism basically for two reasons. Because we got the Second Chechen War, and we got terrorist attacks all over the country, including Moscow, and in September, 2 apartment bombings we got in Moscow. And also because we got the new president, we got the new leader of the country, coming straight from the Russian and before that Soviet security services, Vladimir Putin. So in 2000, we decided to launch our web site, Agentura.ru, to be honest, for a very practical reason, because we were extremely young journalists and we didn't have any sources inside. So we needed to find a way to get sources in the security services, and we decided to apply a technological approach We decided to model our website on the American example. There is a great project, secrecy project of the Federation of American Scientists, run by Steve Aftergood, who is he's doing a great job bombarding the US government with Freedom of Information Act requests, declassifying things and actually publishing them online. We try to do the same. Very soon we understood that Russia is not actually the United States. You cannot do that kind of thing. So we we decided to use a traditional journalistic approach. And since 2000, we, as journalists, we worked for several Russian publications. Сегодня, Известия, Moscow News, Echo Moskvy, Novaya Gazeta. And we covered several terrorist attacks in Moscow and in Russia. The hostage taking of the theater in Moscow in 2002, the hostage taking of a school in Beslan in 2004. We also covered several wars, including the war in Lebanon in 2006, and the tensions in Gaza in the same year and in the West Bank. By 2010, we understood that we wanted to sum up what we actually investigated for back then for almost 10 years. And we wanted to write a book about the FSB, the Russian Security Services. We understood it was absolutely impossible already in 2010 to get our book published in Russian. So thanks to some help of our friends, British journalists and American journalists, they helped us to draft a proposal and to find an American publisher. And since 2010, we've been doing this in a very peculiar manner. So we write our books in English. We first publish them in English in the United States and in UK. And then we wait for a year and a half. Usually it takes a year and a half to get our books translated back into Russian. And this is a way for us to get to our audience. It sounds very crazy. So you are sitting in Moscow, you're a Moscow-based journalist, and you write something in a foreign language, hoping that one day it could get back to your audience, translated into your native language by someone else. But this is the way how we operate these days. And we did in this manner the first book, The New Nobility, which was about the FSB, but mostly about domestic operations, though we have several chapters about things like assassinations abroad. And the second book was about the Kremlin's wars on the internet, the Red Web, and it came up in 2015. With the additional chapter we added in 2017 covering the Russian meddling, and the US election. And finally, we decided 2 years ago that probably it's time to do a book not about security, not about technology, but about people. We got the new book about the Russian emigration, about the political component of the Russian emigration. And now I wanted to give a floor to Irina to explain why we decided to do this book.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having us here. And I have to say that when we decided to write a new book on the Russian immigration and the Kremlin, it was extremely difficult decision for us because we have been writing for years on security services, war zone, politics, conflicts, but we were as far from the immigration as you even could imagine, because nobody from our families immigrated, no, even including uncles, many aunties and cousins. At the same time, the Russian diaspora is the third largest in the world, and Russians fled country in big numbers for more than 100 years. And there was a lot of reasons for that. The Tsar's crazy politics toward Jews, then the Russian Second World War, then the First World War, then the Russian Revolution, then the Second World War, and of course, anti-Semitic campaign in the Soviet Union. All these things forced people out of the country. And according to some estimates, Russian diaspora abroad is like 11 million people now. So 11 million people live, Russians live abroad, and they are all Russian immigrants. But why we decided to write the Compatriots, being so far from the immigration? It turned out that the 90s was the only decade when Russia didn't have political immigration. You know that in the 90s, the Russia got open borders for the first time in its history, and a lot of people started moving abroad. But they started moving in both directions. Most of them were moving out of the country, but some of them, the descendants of the first wave of immigration and the descendants of the second wave of immigration, some of them came back to capture the new opportunities in capitalist Russia. So it was happy times. Everybody traveling everybody could travel in any direction. But it turned out that when Putin came in power in 2000, he immediately reintroduced political immigration. And even in 2000, he forced the first group of his political opponent out of the countries. It was a group of Russian oligarchs. He started with people who challenged him openly because they were owners of independent and liberal media, at least independent from the Kremlin. Simultaneously, the Kremlin came to see Russian immigrants as a tool for promoting its influence abroad. And for this purpose, the Kremlin created a concept of Ruski Mir, or Russian world, which means quite at the first glance, quite innocent concept of this is. According to the Kremlin, this is a worldwide community of Russian-speaking people whose identity closely connected with Russian culture and with Russian history. So as a result, we got two things here. Putin has been pushing his political opponents out of the country for years, and sometimes literally putting them on the plane to have him out of the country. It happened with Russian oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was initially sent to prison for 10 years, and then because of the forthcoming Olympic Games, Putin was put under some kind of pressure from the West, and he wanted to improve his image, and he freed him and literally put him on the plane to expel from the country forever. But of course, after that, Khodorkovsky did not. When it became clear that Khodorkovsky did not stop his political activity, he just didn't stop his political activity, and he did not stop to challenge on the Kremlin. These people, like Khodorkovsky, found out themselves in a quite dubious and dangerous position. Once out of Russia, the political exile start presenting a challenge to the Kremlin, and the Kremlin takes this challenge very seriously. And the Kremlin started using against the political exiles all old methods like intimidation, spying, and even killings and poisoning. In our book, we tell a story of young Russian opposition politician Vladimir Karamurza, who now lives in Washington. But he lobbied against the Kremlin extensively, and he was on the Hill, on Senate, and on Congress, and he promoted anti-Kremlin. He promoted anti-Kremlin sanctions for years, and he's still doing this. He was poisoned twice when he visited Moscow in 2015 and then in 2017. Fortunately, he survived, and he's still active. And it's surprising for me, but he's still traveling to Russia. But when we started our research for the new book, we thought that the modern Russian intelligence was quite different from the KGB of the 80s, and especially from the Stalin secret services. But when we finished our research, we came to a very, very sad conclusion that the Russian modern intelligence services, they are still very much like the KGB, the KGB of the 80s, or like the KGB branch of the 80s, and they unfortunately still inherited some methods from the Stalin security services. You know that Stalin's obsession with political emigration was a defining experience for his intelligence services. And you know that when Stalin expelled his biggest political rival and also famous Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, and when he found out that Trotsky didn't stop fighting against the Kremlin and against the Stalin personally, and he launched even his own media called Bulletin of Opposition, where he published the stories of what's really going on in the Soviet Union, and he criticized Stalin personally. After Stalin found out all these things, which was absolutely predictable, he tasked many agents in his intelligence services to spy on Trotsky and eventually kill him. But after Trotsky's assassination, Stalin didn't stop. His obsession with his political opponent and this political immigrant was so huge that he tasked his intelligence service to spy on Trotsky's followers, Trotskyists. And my favorite example of this that in January 41, the Moscow Center sent a secret cable to the chief of its intelligence station in New York, which we called Residentura, and urging him to keep on the struggle against Trotskyists. Imagine the Second World War already started, France was invaded, and there was only a few months until Germany attacked Russia, and Stalin was obsessed with Trotsky supporters, with Trotsky followers, Trotskyists. And he spent his resources of his intelligence service to spy on them. So unfortunately, this experience defined methods of Soviet intelligence even after Stalin's death, and unfortunately, it had a big lasting impact on the modern Russian intelligence.
And so let me continue here. As Irina described, our book focuses on one particular topic in the very large issue of the Russian immigration, which is extremely large, the political component. And it's geographically, we decided to focus on our book mostly by the limits of the United States. Why? Because it turned out that many political organizations of the Russian immigration, from the white immigration of the first wave to the 1970s and 80s, were based in the United States and in particular in New York. Of course, some of them started off in Paris and Belgrade and Berlin, but thanks to the war, they moved to the United States, including Trotskyites. And we wanted also to look at how the Americans treated the political organizations of the émigrés, what we wanted from them, how they tried to use them, and how successful it was. But we are journalists, and we are talking about modern things, the situation right now. And it's been always quite ironic that you have two things simultaneously. On the one hand, you have the Kremlin, Soviet Kremlin and Putin's Kremlin, pushing political opponents or critics of the Kremlin out of the country, and always claiming that these people pose no threat to the political stability in the country. And you can trace this to expulsion of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, or, for instance, this example with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, or Garry Kasparov, who was given a kind of warning that it's better not to get back to Russia. And at the same time, once these people found themselves in the West, the Kremlin gets obsessed with the threat posed by these people. And on the surface, you can see that people forced out of the country, for instance, right now, they are not the most popular opposition politicians in the country. And we still have Alexei Navalny in the country, and he travels abroad, but he mostly based in Moscow. And he's much more popular, way more popular than Khodorkovsky or Garry Kasparov or Vladimir Kara-Murza. So why is that? Why the Kremlin is so obsessed by the challenge posed by people who live abroad? And I think that the explanation of this, if I can call it paranoia, is that a lot of people inside the Kremlin and security services, they believe that a small bunch of political exiles, if given a chance, could get back to Russia and change the political regime, exactly as it had happened in 1917 when a small bunch of communists and Bolsheviks, led by Lenin and Trotsky, got back to Russia and destroyed the mighty Russian Empire with probably the most powerful secret police in the world back then. And of course we know that this approach is completely ahistorical, that there were many reasons which contributed to the destruction of the Russian Empire, not to mention the First World War. And of course we know that not only the Russian Empire was destroyed, but actually 4 empires were destroyed because of the war. But we are talking here about perceptions. And these perceptions define the Kremlin approach to the political immigration. But we also, in our book, we try to look into the real situation, into the reality. And it's interesting that given the long period of the Russian immigration, the political organizations of the Russian immigration and their activities here could be seen as a textbook of what could be done from abroad with a country like Russia, and what could not be done. Because since the 1920s, Russian immigration tried almost every trick to try to change the situation in Soviet Russia. Starting in the 1920s, for instance, they sent undercover agents back to Russia to bomb some facilities and to kill some officials. When Bolshevik officials came to the West, they got killed by the agents of the emigre organizations. When Soviet army became involved in a military conflict outside the Russian borders, say in Spain, Russian white immigration sent some soldiers and officers to fight them. When the war started, we got some of the emigre siding with the enemy and helping the Germans to fight the Red Army. After the war, of course, we have the whole range of activities from espionage to propaganda. They sent balloons through the borders from Austria with leaflets, trying to change the public opinion in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet bloc, and socialist bloc. And it's a very sad story, to be honest, because if you try to assess the effectiveness of all these activities for almost 100 years, you can see that almost nothing worked. It was a history of failures. And they achieved almost nothing. And what was really bad, that the Russian immigration became notoriously incapable of building up political organizations which could unite them and to provide a kind of united front to deal with the Soviet Union. They constantly argued, intrigued. They staged walkout protests when the Americans tried to get them in one place and to sit and develop some solutions. Finally, when we tried to find at least one thing which actually worked, we found it. And it was then the Russians acted as individuals when they wrote books. Books was the only thing which actually worked. So when Solzhenitsyn had his novels smuggled to the West, or when you had Svetlana Alliluyeva, Stalin's daughter, coming to the West and then writing her book about her relationship with father, that had a tremendous impact on the Western public opinion and perception in the West about what's going on in the Soviet Union. And it was the only thing which actually worked. But in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, many things completely changed. And one thing one hope which some Americans had, like George Kennan, never actually realized. It was the hope that if the Soviet regime would collapse, political organizations of the emigre could get back to Russia and have a say in the political future of the country. That unfortunately never happened. What happened is that some descendants of the Russian emigres, Russian Americans mostly, they decided to come back not because of political reasons, but because of obvious reasons. They wanted to make money, and there are great opportunities for that. The interesting thing here is that back then, in the 1990s, Russia was desperate because the new Russian government needed to solve two big problems. They needed to open two doors. One door was to help to move money out of Russia to the West. And the second door was to help to move money from the West to Russia. In both cases, Russian Americans were instrumental to open these doors. And we got many problems thanks to that. And in a way, Russian Americans contributed a lot to the situation in the 1990s. But the interesting thing here is that you might start with making money, but in Russia, unfortunately, it always ends up with something really political. So when Putin came to power, and because he's a trained KGB agent, and he used to see everything and everybody in terms of potential recruitment, he used it with Russian Americans to achieve something inside the country and outside. And he scored some spectacular successes. For instance, he used Russian Americans to subordinate the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, based in New York, to Moscow Church, and it was a very spectacular success. On the way, the Russian Americans also helped him to secure support from many descendants of the first wave of Russian immigration, Russian aristocracy actually. And it was a very interesting phenomenon. Just imagine you have descendants of the Russian aristocrats who actually had fled Russia out of fear of Bolsheviks and Cheka, and then you have the descendants now expressing support for a guy who used to be with the KGB and actually extremely proud of it. But that's how what we have now, the situation. We have lots of people inside of the Russian community very supportive of Kremlin's activities inside the country and also outside, including the annexation of Crimea. The last point I wanted to say is we are getting back to my point about fear. As Irina said, we have now all kinds of methods used against Russians abroad, including poisoning and killings. And it sent a very strong message, intimidating message, not only to people who live in Russia, but also to people who live outside. And that makes Russians abroad extremely vulnerable. And given the fact that the Kremlin invested a lot into building networks of compatriots, we need to understand that he and his people actually see the Russians abroad as a huge recruitment base which is extremely vulnerable right now because, well, many people here understand they could be attacked because we had Litvinenko, Skripal, and several other mysterious cases of the Russians who mysteriously died in the West. Thank you. Thank you.
Elizabeth and I thought that we would take the opportunity to add prerogatives of the chair, let's put it that way, to ask the first couple of questions. Elizabeth, you want to start?
Sure. I have many questions.
Just one.
Yeah, just one. Okay. I want to start with a light question. You know, recently there's been a TV series called The Americans,
right.
And there's also a new movie about Trotsky. And I'm curious what your reactions are to either of these or any of these. Maybe you haven't seen them, but
you mean the Russian?
The Russian movie.
Oh,
of
the
Trotsky.
Russian movie about Trotsky.
Because there's a lot that one can say about that movie.
Have you watched it on Netflix?
I only watched part of it. I was so
on Netflix.
Yeah.
It's on Netflix
So
for everybody. Everybody can watch it, and I urge you to watch it because it's very interesting. The thing is that 2 years ago, when we got in 2017, the Kremlin struggled how to approach and how to react to the centenary of the Russian Revolution. Because what Putin tries to do, he tries to be a successor to both things. He wants to be an embodiment of Russian Empire, and also he wants to be a descendant of the Soviet secret police, which is very difficult to, combine. So as a result, we got very confusing and mixed picture in 2017, and part of it was this TV series. And one thing which what you understand when you watch this TV series, that Trotsky was, and Lenin, of course, they were agents of the German General Staff long before the First World War started, like maybe 10 years before, and well, it's completely against history because back then Germany and Russia were actually quite close. But the idea that communists and Bolsheviks were actually the agents of some hostile foreign power is one of the main ideas of this TV series. And of course, we understand the message. But political exiles, if they help it from abroad, they could pose a substantial threat.
Yeah. We could have a long conversation, but
Yeah.
let me ask one more serious question. You've mostly been working on what you call political exiles, immigrants who've left. I'm wondering about the connection between business and politics in the West among people who've emigrated. Obviously, we have the recent arrests of the two gentlemen who were Giuliani's associates. We've been hearing rumors about the possibility of building nuclear power plants around the world that would be built in part perhaps by Russian emigres. I'm curious whether there's a comment you want to make about the ways in which Russian emigres can get caught up in the Kremlin's agenda, or do you think they're just acting on their own?
That was actually the question. You scooped me.
Sorry.
Let me ask the question in a slightly different way, and then
Go
I'd
for
like
it.
your response. There's been a lot of speculation in the West that any number of the Russian emigres who are here are somehow agents of the Kremlin.
Of course not. No,
No, but they have proven to be useful in what we might call the Kremlin's objectives. So I wonder, it's a take on Elizabeth's question, but it's beyond the business. I mean, are they making contact with the Trump campaign, with the Trump administration? I mean, this has really been, of course, our focus here. But is there more of that than we're even aware of, as some of these people have been either pushed out or have moved out of Russia?
Yeah, because many immigrants try to find themselves between two countries because usually they speak both languages and they know very well both cultures, and so they many of them want to use this situation for their own profit. So I mean, I think that was the main motivation behind the activity of these two guys who now in prison, who now arrested, and they immigrate. They are not Russian immigrants. One immigrated from Ukraine and another one immigrated from Belarus. But I don't think that they were a part of. I think that their political motivation behind their activity was their own greedy and huge desire to make money, and they got themselves. They involved into the political situation because they were greedy, and they found out. They decided that this way to use political situation for their own profit will be a good way to, and they would get away with this. So it's not.
It's not a big conspiracy, I think.
It's not a big conspiracy, I think, but it's some kind of typical for some kind of immigrants, because we also have some examples in our book immigrants who tried to use their Russian origin and to make money in Russia, and even they got close to the Putin. They got very supportive of Putin. They get approval from Putin, because it's impossible to make big money without the Kremlin's approval. And they made big money in Russia. So and they got rich.
I have another question about the Russian world. I'm curious, when Putin began to speak about it, do you think he always had in mind that it could be useful? What do you think is the motivation for this discussion of the Russian world? Is it world power, make Russia bigger? Is it trying to combine the Tsarist and the Soviet past, which I think is something very important to him and very difficult? I agree with you. Is it something else? What's behind that whole concept for you?
I think it evolved with time, because the very first Congress Putin had, the Congress of Compatriots, was in 2000. And back then, Putin didn't, for instance, didn't think about the Russians living in neighboring countries. Mm-hmm. And now he's using and exploiting this idea that we need to protect the Russians in, say, Ukraine or Kazakhstan and in the Baltics. And for him, it's a very big thing. But back then, 19 years ago, he was not ready to use this point. Actually, when he went to this Congress and he found that it was full of people who came from former Soviet republics, he got so pissed off that he fired a minister in charge of arranging this Congress, because he expected to see only people from the West. He wanted to see people from the United States, especially from Europe. And back then he was obsessed with the idea of the Russian immigration in France, and soon he arranged the moving of some of the remnants of very big names in the Russian white immigration back to Russia, because he wanted, back then his main objective was purely domestic. Back then he wanted to destroy the idea of the other Russia. So what does it mean? It means that back in the Soviet Union, and I remember that I was a kid when Perestroika started, but I remember that on television there was a constant talk that, of course, the Russian society was in big trouble, and almost every institution in the Soviet Union was compromised, including the church, because of communist and ideology. But there are some people, some Russians, some intellectuals, aristocrats, some really good people living somewhere, and they present the other Russia. And if they come back, that could help us to build a new democratic Russia. And that was actually the goal of Yeltsin, because Yeltsin started this process. He started inviting people from the West, and he wanted them to help to build this new democratic Russia. Putin saw this as a challenge, and he didn't want any kind of alternative versions. He needed one united Russia with no versions and no drafts. That's why he wanted, that was his idea behind the first Congress of Compatriots. Of course, and also, again, getting to the point about exploitation of the Russians abroad. Remember, back when we had a very famous Russian writer, Eduard Limonov. Mm-hmm. And
explain.
Yes, he was a Russian emigre. He emigrated to the United States, went to France, and he became very famous when he got back to Russia in the 1990s. And also he launched his own political party, very nationalistic. Actually, it was called National Bolshevik Party. It was a kind of, performance probably for him. but he pursued a very nationalistic agenda, and he was the first guy to proclaim the idea that we need to protect the Russians abroad by force. He had this famous slogan, we would have our MiGs, meaning jet fighters, in Riga. That was his slogan. And he was put to jail by Putin.
For extremism.
For extremism, for expressing these kind of ideas. And if you compare his slogans back then in 2000 with what Putin is saying now, well, there is striking similarity. It's exactly the same language. So Putin evolved with time, and I think he got to the idea, of exploitation of the Russian world as we see it now, probably after, or maybe right before the annexation of Crimea.
Yeah, that makes great sense.
Well, we don't want to monopolize the conversation up here. Please, if you have questions of our guests, there are mics on either side. Please go to the mics. There are mics on either side. Identify yourself, and please just ask a question.
Thank you for the lecture. I'm Andrei Roman from Berkshire School in Sheffield, Massachusetts. And I only have one question. What are some of the examples of Kremlin's use of soft power or cultural diplomacy that promotes the idea of Russian world in the United States specifically?
I think one of the big examples is what is going on the 9th of May. We have this initiative, it's called the Immortal Regiment. It means that on the 9th of May, you have thousands of people marching the streets of Manhattan, but also several other cities in the United States, holding portraits of the veterans of the Second World War. And on the surface, it's a very cultural, historical initiative. The idea is to remind, officially, the idea is to remind the Americans that actually the Americans should be grateful to the Soviet Union because we won the war. But the problem here is that it's very nationalistic because the symbols they use, for example, they use this special ribbon with St. George ribbon. It was used by Russian troops in Crimea and Ukraine, and it became a symbol of the Russian military presence in Ukraine. And it's exactly how we now understand this and regard this symbol in Russia. So this idea of the Immortal Regiment actually is a projection of the Russian view of how Russia should be considered and seen by the world. That's one of the examples.
Спасибо.
Please.
Good evening. My name is Vesko Garčević. I was a former Montenegrin ambassador in NATO, now at Boston University. I have, let's say, two questions, again about Ruski Mir, but from a slightly different angle. My first question is, I would like to see your comments on how Russia uses Orthodox Church to reach out people in its world, which means in Orthodox world and in the West, and how it uses sister churches for the same purpose, for the same goal. And also, do you see that Russian world or Ruski Mir has actually two circles? The first circle refers to Russian-speaking diaspora, and the second circle refers to Orthodox population, Orthodox Slavs, because I see branches of Russian world, actually branches of offices of Russian world all over the Balkans in Orthodox countries.
You're absolutely right that Ruski Mir, Russian world concept, use both Russian culture, Russian history, and Orthodoxy because it's very close to each other. And very often, Russian churches abroad is using as a base for cultural activity and some kind of recruitment people who are Russian immigrants for, I don't know, for promoting the Kremlin's ideology or Kremlin's propaganda or Kremlin's ideas in European countries and here in the United States. But the concept, why the Kremlin created a concept of Russian vault, because Putin, you know that Putin comes from the KGB, and by definition, by his psychology, he's a very suspicious person. He get used. He was grown as a person who look at the world as a collection of threats. So every person should, because he is a KGB officer and he spent his youth inside the KGB, and he was trained as a Soviet spy. So he's seen on the vault as a big threat. So every person should be suspicious, and every activity should be also mostly it poses a threat. It can pose a threat. So of course a lot of activities that was organized by the Russian Cultural Center and also the Orthodox Church was organized because Putin looked at Russian immigrants as a recruitment base for something. So, which is normal for him, but not very normal for this concept, because cultural activity shouldn't be like this. It shouldn't be considered as a recruitment base.
And I can give you some examples you asked for. For instance, when I mentioned it with 9th of the May initiative of the Immortal Regiment, in New York, it's organized by a guy who is by chance also the head of the youth organization with the Russian Orthodox Church in New York. So you see that connection. Also, for some of the festivities, I would say, on the 9th of the May, when people, for instance, they put on uniforms, old Soviet uniforms, and march in the woods, the church facilities were used in New Jersey. It's one example. Another one is, for instance, the question of Syria. The Russian Orthodox Church uses the argument that we need to protect Christians in Syria, and there were contacts between the Russian Orthodox Church, Ilarion especially, who is in charge of the foreign department of the Moscow Church. We have some people in the close circle of Trump, because it's such a noble idea if you look at it, like we need to protect Christians in Syria, and why not to talk about it? So this kind of channels, this kind of argument is used and could be used again.
Thank you. Keith Caton. I recently graduated from the Harvard Kennedy School and work in renewable energy currently. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the increased adoption of renewables and the decreased dependence on natural resources, and how that will affect Russia's geopolitical influence.
Well, it's a difficult question for us because we are not experts in this field.
We are not experts on oil and gas, something, so it's clearly they use it for its own goals, but
we just don't know. I'm sorry.
it's far from our field of expertise.
Thank you.
Isaac Caper, I'm a student at Northeastern. What about Navalny has made him safe from political assassination if his compatriots abroad are seemingly less safe, with Skripal as the most notable recent example? Wouldn't he be at more risk since he's in Russia preaching to a domestic audience for change in Russia?
You mean
inside the country or outside the country?
Navalny's inside the country.
Yeah.
Why is he safe?
He's not safe, actually. He had his brother in prison for years, as you know, and he was only recently released. And Navalny himself spent several months, actually, and because of the Moscow protests just, again, recently. But the problem with the Kremlin approach that it's we are not living anymore in a totalitarian state, which means that you have strict rules. What is allowed and what is not. We live in a much more flexible environment, which means that there are no rules, and we never know actually what is fine and what is not. We have some people in Moscow who are doing things like Navalny, or we have some very courageous journalists who are exposing very sensitive things, for instance, about the Russian military intelligence. And they continue their activities from Russia. And at the same time, we have lots of people who were beaten up or sent to jail for posting some photographs or cartoons online. And the idea of this flexible approach is when you live in such a murky situation,
we don't know where the line is, and nobody knows. So
you need to guess all the time.
You can be punished for everything, and it sent you a very strong message, and it put many people in a position when they need to develop self-censorship. People develop self-censorship on posting something, expressing their opinion on social networks, because tens of people were punished for posting anything critical of the Kremlin on the social networks, but even for some innocent things. A lot of journalists developing self-censorship, writing stories and articles on the Kremlin, because that is very difficult to understand where is the line. There is no rules, so you could be punished for something very innocent, but you could not be. But you also can get away with very serious things like investigating something, investigating security services activities abroad and inside the country. So, strong message.
Yeah, Dima.
Dmitry Gorenberg, Davis Center, Harvard. So when people talk about compatriots, usually we think of Russians in the United States and London and Western Europe. Does it reach beyond that? Are there connections in Latin America, Asia, other parts of the world that unfortunately I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I'm just curious if there's a reach that goes beyond kind of the usual places that we think of.
We decided to focus mostly on the United States, as I said, because most of the political organizations, most of the political activities was based here in the United States. Of course, this topic is extremely big, and you have lots of Russians now living in Ukraine or in the Baltics, and there are several very interesting things which are happening there. But the book is, well, you cannot make more than 300 pages, you would be killed by your publisher.
Yeah, but is there, I mean, in studying the top, I mean, beyond what's in the book, is there, I mean, maybe, can you talk a little bit about, is there, are there things you know about, Russians in China or Africa or whatever? I mean, we saw, this Wagner going, getting involved in Africa. Are there connections? Are there local connections there? I don't know.
As far as we know, we never actually witnessed any activities, prominent activities of the Russians, say, in local Russians based in Australia or Africa. The most interesting examples we have is the Baltics, of course, and Ukraine, Kazakhstan. There you have a lot of interesting things, and mostly it's to me, because we're surrounded by friends who left the country recently, especially after 2014, and we have many friends, journalists, who decided to leave the country after the annexation of Crimea, and some political activists, and it's mostly about the Baltics and Ukraine, and to be honest, it's a very sad story, because in these countries, the governments were welcome at them, but they're still struggling to find a way to find them a proper use, I would say. And in a way, it reflects the history. Remember, after the revolution, many Russians decided to stay in the Baltics, and they were not really welcomed there because local governments, they feared this presence, the Russian threat. And I sort of understand why it was there, because the Russian white immigrants in these countries were still very imperialistic, and we wanted to get back to this big Russian empire, which probably was not a great thought for, say, for Estonia, independent. But I mean, now the new Russian immigration is completely different. They are much more westernized. They don't want to to recreate the Russian Empire. They are ready to study the local languages, and I think it's one of the great but the opportunities which we are missing right now. But we still have a chance to create recreate the concept of the rise of Russia. Maybe, for instance, to start a university or to give positions for the Russian intellectuals in some universities in Ukraine or Estonia or Lithuania, and that would be a great thing because you would have this alternative for many people who live in Moscow and feel uncomfortable, but it seems that nobody actually cares.
Please.
Hi, my name's Mark Montarch. I'm a kind of a Cold War era graduate of West Point where I had a concentration in Soviet studies. My question goes back to the 1996 election, the re-election campaign by Yeltsin. And I wonder if perhaps supporters of Yeltsin at that time might have overplayed their hand a bit in the West. In particular, Bill Clinton. The super cynic might even say instead of Hillary Clinton and Vladimir Putin having this sort of catfight, Vladimir Putin should have written her a thank you note for everything that Bill did to support Boris Yeltsin, which of course then ushered in Vladimir Putin. But my question is, when you think about loans, loans for shares, and some of the other programs, and the outside, I'll call it participation, but sort of influence in that election, if maybe that election had gone a different way, that we might be in a different place today.
Wow. It's difficult to think what could be done differently. An interesting thing that actually after these elections in 1996, some Russians, some members of the Russian security services, they actually tried to help Clinton in an election. There is a great story in a book written by Robert Baer, a former CIA officer. Probably you know him. And it's a great story how Korzhakov reportedly, who was the chief of the security service of Yeltsin,
Personal guard.
a personal Praetorian guard, and how he traveled to Italy and had some strange marquee meeting with some guys, and actually he proposed it like a help, like, well, you help us, we are ready to help you. And an officer who was the president of the meeting, he got so scared, he reported this conversation to Washington and got everybody scared. So, well, it sort of reflects that you have, that in the country with no democratic traditions, you have a lot of people who are, by definition, extremely adventurous and ready to break any rules, and no matter in Russia or in the West. They just want to get things done, and it could be really, really dangerous.
I met Korzhakov last summer, and I asked him all these questions about the 1996 election, which was a very controversial point in Russian history. He didn't confirm this story that they tried to interfere into the American election and send money for the Clinton's campaign. But he told me that of course, we should be very critical to this guy because he was fired by Yeltsin in 1995, and he's still very angered by this. But he told me that they accepted money from abroad for the Yeltsin's campaign, and he personally was responsible for that because, as he explained me, he was only one honest person in the campaign, and everybody trusted him.
With money.
With money, and he accumulated all this money and spent all of them for the campaign.
He was the one with the suitcase of cash, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right. He was very proud of it.
He was very proud of it. He said, it's happened because I'm only one honest person.
Great.
So I enjoyed The Compatriots, a great book. And for anyone who hasn't read The New Nobility, I'll plug that one too.
Thank you.
Thank you. you.
Please.
Hi, David. Good morning. I'm a faculty here in Sloan School of Management and also a happy a colleague of Elizabeth and MIT Russia program. First, I wanted to thank you for naming the 11 million figure of Russian speakers. I didn't realize there was so many of us in the West. But my question perhaps is a bit naive. I understand the methods that you described that Putin is using and his team is using, ranging from poisoning to parades and so on. I'm still struggling to understanding what are his goals. Why is he doing? What is he trying to get from us, from Russians and so on? I can understand the short-term goals of like next election and so on, but there's many Trump sympathizers among Russians, so that might give some short-term gains. But this sounds like a very expensive expenditure to tap on that many. Not that many people, actually. 11 million people. It's not that much. What is his strategic goal for this? I'm sorry if I missed this answer in your previous remarks, but I just wanted to hear
It's a very good question. Maybe part of the answer, and I don't have a full answer, but maybe part of the answer that Putin always cares about domestic audience, and for the domestic audience, the most important thing is. Putin has been playing on these feelings for years, is to get back the feeling of, we used to have this superpower, we lost it, and we have this feeling of grievance against the West. And Putin has been really good at playing on this feeling that I can get you back, I can give you the sense of national pride. And every scandal with the United States, he tried to use to this effect. I remember this big scandal with the Russian illegals in 2010. This story was portrayed as victory surprisingly, in both countries. And you sort of understand why it was a big victory for FBI, because they caught these guys. But it was...
Remind the audience about Anna Chapman. And
in 2010, FBI investigated and finally arrested 10 Russian illegals. Some of them lived actually here in Cambridge. And one of them was, of course, this red-haired Anna Chapman. And what happened next, there was a swap in the Cold War way. So four people from Russia who were convicted they were sentenced to several years for spying for the Americans. They were sent to Britain, and two of them decided to stay in Britain, and two of them decided to go to live here in the United States. And in return, we got all these 10 guys. So the interesting thing that it was this operation and scandal was portrayed as a big victory in Russia too. These guys were given a red carpet, and the Chapman was given a TV show. Some guys were given very good positions in Russian oil corporations and in GIMO. They teach in GIMO now, at least one of them. And the idea is not that these people were not really competent. The idea is just to say, look, we are capable of doing this again. We can send our people to the United States to be there for years. So we are back. And the same thing actually happened in 2016. You can think, well, actually the whole thing was exposed. The Kremlin got caught with the hackers. Why we are so happy? And many were really happy because there was an idea that you can see Putin in the middle of this big scandal, and he looked like a kingmaker in the most powerful country in the world. So if he can use Russians abroad to play on the feelings of national pride, of that we matter, but the Russians matter, but you can have Russians marching on Manhattan with St. George ribbon, and it could be seen as a projection of Russian power, he's extremely happy with that, because this could be seen in Russia as a new proof that Putin is good, and he is giving us back the sense of meaning, and and gives us a sense of our identity back.
And of course, there was some real achievement that the Kremlin, after Skripal's poisoning, they found out that a lot of people in Moscow and abroad really got really scared because they eventually understood, political immigrants understood that they could be the next victim. And whether you're in London or New York, there is no guarantee for you. But people inside the country also understood that they're living in a state which is sending killers across the world. And this feeling is really scared, and when people understood that got really scared because nobody, a lot of people, independent, liberal people, didn't believe that our state have something to do with Iranian state, with Iran, and our methods have something common with Ayatollah Khomeini's methods. When they understood, they really that's a really unpleasant feeling to think about this, to understand this.
Yeah, the climate in Moscow completely changed after that.
After this interview of these two military intelligence guy who was exposed by Russian and Russian journalist and cooperation with Bellingcat, after they gave this really great interview to RT, people understood who they really were, and they got scared. That's
I think
a great achievement.
The Skripal case, I'm curious if you think this is true, is particularly interesting also because they can play it both ways at once. By chance, the trade minister from the Russian embassy in Washington was coming up to Boston just the week that happened, and he went to great lengths to tell my students that it couldn't have been the Russian government, it was a local production of Novichok, and so on. Okay. So it's really interesting that, I'm curious what you think about this. What's great about this kind of murder is they simultaneously send two completely contradictory signals. They send the signal, we did it, you know we did it, and we didn't do it, and we're going to deny it upside down and sideways. And it's an interesting kind of chess.
Yes, it's extremely...
I've understood.
You're absolutely right. It's absolutely... it's very skillful. When we've been researching for the book, and almost every prominent emigre sooner or later, raised the issue and asked this question about Skripal. And I had a very, very interesting conversation with a guy who was a priest and a financier, which is a strange combination. And he was an instrumental in this operation of uniting two Russian churches. And as you can imagine, he's a very high-level priest, and he's Russian-American, so he still has his American passport, and so he's absolutely safe, you can imagine, because he helped Putin to achieve this very important goal, and he's highly positioned inside of the church hierarchy. So he didn't want to talk to me. Finally, I convinced him to meet me, and he started our conversations saying, Andrei, you have very powerful enemies. So he tried to scare me immediately. But after the conversation ended, like in an hour or two, finally he said, Andrei, you should have some good sources inside. Please tell me why we decided to kill Skripal. And he was visibly, he was anxious. Why the FSB, why he was, why they decided to poison him. Because he understood that there was no rules anymore. And it's a big problem because actually why Skripal was so important here. We had some assassinations before, but we have even a law which actually led the Russian security services to kill abroad. It was approved in 2006, and the idea was to kill terrorists abroad. The problem here that officially Skripal was acquitted by Putin because that was part of the legal procedure of swap. You cannot be swapped until you are not first acquitted, and he was acquitted. So there was no legal framework for that. What we have instead, we have some operational reasons For instance, some people said that probably Skripal was poisoned because he was reactivated by the British, or maybe he was reactivated by the Americans. So he was involved in some intelligence operation. That's why the Russians decided to send a message to the Americans and the British. But we are talking here about operational reasons, and you never can know these operational reasons. That's completely murky, and nobody could guess it if you are not inside. And that put so many people in this position only to guess who might be the next. Because if we live in a world when everything is decided according to operational reasons, well, it's quite a dangerous place to live.
Can I just jump in? It strikes me from listening to you that it's sort of a two-way street, that on the one hand, the Ruski Mir, the Russians who are abroad, can be cultivated to promote Russian interests, or at least to aggrandize the image of the Russian state. On the other hand, they're seen as enemies.
Yeah, exactly. That's the topic of the book.
And it goes back to the questions that were asked here about where that line is, and as long as you're cheerleading for Russia, you're safe. And I mean, is that how you might describe it? But if you do, I mean, some people allege that Skripal was also working with the Czechs in kind of counterintelligence operations and giving away KGB or GRU secrets, and therefore he was assassinated because Putin kept talking about betrayal. But Skripal is at one level, but the 11 million sort of average citizens of various countries now are operating at a completely different level. So are they assets to be used? Are they just cheering squads? If you're known in Russia, are you much more vulnerable than otherwise? I mean, what you've described is this sense of, again, cheerleading is the word that keeps coming to mind, this idea that somehow Russia is great because of all these people here, and there are links between these pockets of Russian exiles, or Russian, even second generation, or is it just when you leave, it depends on when you leave, who you are, what you did, and are you therefore not an asset, but someone to be targeted?
I think that people who are living abroad here in the United States or in Europe, these immigrants are not vulnerable because there are a lot of them, and in terms of they're not political exiles, and they're not Putin's opponents, so they couldn't be. If even they did something bad, they couldn't be blackmailed by the Russian security services because they are under the United States or European countries' protection. So there is no direct threat for them, but psychologically, immigrants always are on some kind of age, and so if you're not doing well in the new country, if you are experiencing some financial and psychological difficulties, this is a very usual thing for immigrants. You may be psychologically wanted to be closer to your former country or country of your origin, and if there is some kind of activity organized by the Russian state, especially by its cultural center, and there are some you may be offered to join to some organizations, like can be offered by some possibilities, or maybe some little money for doing some job for them. So this is a position when they can find out themselves a little vulnerable. But they, of course, everybody can refuse you. It depends on people.
To be honest, I don't completely agree with that. Actually, to be honest, when we were writing our books, we had this constant fight. It's kind of normal. But I just wanted to add that maybe the one thing I learned while writing about the Russian security services for 19 years is that they could be not extremely competent, sometimes dealing with real threats like terrorism or espionage. Sometimes we're extremely sloppy when we are conducting their operations. But what they know, and they know really well, they know how to use fear. And they know how to use fear in the country and outside. And we know how to send a message to people. And we know, sometimes you think that, as Irina said, well, formally, legally, no, you cannot be vulnerable. But, well, the Kremlin actually, it knows how to send this message.
You can't. You disagree
I
with
wanna-
that. You can't just. Have been approached. I've been Russian immigrant, and if you're approached by some guys from the Russian embassy, you can say no.
I think it's.
It's okay.
Of course, you. I mean, I think it might be more complicated.
I want to try a different question, but only because no one else is asking any questions. But one of the characters I think you do write about a little bit is Mikhail Lesin, who was Putin's communication director.
Minister.
Minister,
Yes.
right, minister. And went with him to Chechnya on January 1st of 2000, carrying or not carrying the nuclear suitcase, I've never known, and was really in Putin's good circle. And then he ends up dead in Washington, D.C. in DuPont Circle. What's the story there?
Oh, it's one of the mysteries right now because there were many rumors that, but first of all, Mikhail Lesin had his family here. Yeah. And probably you know this excellent, actually really, I'm not joking, really good movie with Brad Pitt, Fury, about the American tank, Sherman, I think, during the last days of war, how they're fighting tigers, and it's a great movie. It was produced by Lesin's son. So his family was well established here, and he some years before his death he lost his positions in Russia. He was fired from his company, and he lost his position of presidential advisor. So he was not extremely on good terms with Putin. And then there was a rumor in Moscow that he moved to the States and he started cooperating with local law enforcement. And there was a rumor that probably he was under some sort of protection of FBI. That's why he was put in this hotel. It was never confirmed, actually. But the problem here that we are not talking about reality again. We are talking about perceptions. And then if some people in the Kremlin decided that he started cooperating with the FBI, that could be really dangerous for him. But we don't know the whole picture.
Why we don't know? Because what is very sad to me is that his death in Washington was not properly investigated by the American authorities. Still a lot of questions.
If there are no other questions, can I ask another question? Going back to your book on cyber and hacking and everything, what is, I'm trying to figure out how to ask the question. We know that the Russians hacked during the DNC during the 2016 election. We also know that they used bots and other, public platforms to promote the outcome we presume they wanted. But some of that was done by Prigozhin and the Internet Research Agency, et cetera. Do you have a sense of whether it was at Putin's direction or was the Internet Research Agency doing something because, I know the boss will like it and maybe I'll get, be put in a better position in terms of Russian politics? Do you see it going one way or the other, or?
I think, first of all, after 2015, especially after 2015, after Putin started selective repressions, and these selective repressions targeted in the country almost every strata of the Russian society, and we got governors in jail, ministers in jail, and we got FSB generals in jail. So nobody now feels immune. It was absolutely impossible to do something that important without first consulting with the main guy. But the problem here is, and we are describing this story in the added chapter of the Red Web, but we believe that there was a personal history here. And the personal history is that Putin, for years, he was obsessed with Hillary Clinton. And he got obsessed with her because in 2011, 2012, when we got protests in Moscow, he believed back then that these protests were inspired and instigated by a State Department, and Hillary Clinton was State Secretary. There was some unfortunate coincidence. For instance, Hillary Clinton back then He had some advisors on the internet who said that social networks was a Che Guevara of our days, and you just need to understand, how it could be taken by paranoid Kremlin. Well, you have people close to the State Department, working for the State Department, saying openly that social media, American social media, as a tool for revolution. And it was exactly how they back then understood this. And what happened in 2016 was, probably you remember, there was a big scandal, Panama Papers. And it exposed lots of big names having accounts in offshores. But one of these guys who was exposed was a cellist. And he was, by chance, a personal friend of Putin. And it turned out that he was in possession of accounts for billions and billions of dollars. And everybody took it as a sign that actually he was put in charge of taking care of Putin's personal money. The problem was that for some reasons, mysterious reasons, Putin was briefed that this operation, Panama Papers, was supervised by Hillary Clinton people. And he was given this kind of brief, and that made him really mad. And he attacked Panama Papers here openly, which was very unusual for him. He defended his personal friend, and actually 2 weeks later, we got dcleaks.com registered. And we believe that was a very important moment for this operation because, of course, Russian hackers were in the DNC system already in 2015. But until the spring of 2016, it was a kind of espionage conventional operation. We just collected the information, probably for some, I don't know, for the use, I don't know, the way usually spies use this kind of stuff. But after that, there was a decision taken to make it public and to attack Hillary Clinton. It was not that much about Trump. It was all about Hillary Clinton. And believe me, I remember when we were in Moscow when Trump got elected. It was such a big surprise to everybody, including people in the Kremlin. Nobody actually predicted that. They just wanted to harm Hillary, also because they believe in this crazy idea of a deep state. They actually believe that the whole thing is already predestined and predetermined. But of course, Hillary Clinton would be the president. But at least we can try to make her weak and vulnerable. When we got Trump, it was a big surprise for everybody.
Looks like we have 2 more questions.
Okay. Suzanne?
Sure. Hi, I'm Suzanne. I'm a first-year PhD student in the MIT Political Science Department. I sort of have an odd question, which is that the classical narrative, right, is that Putin's worldview is formed by his time in the KGB. But I guess if we actually think a little bit about the positions that he held in Dresden and then in St. Petersburg, he wasn't in Berlin, he wasn't in Moscow, he wasn't at the center, but he was kind of off on the periphery, right? So the conclusion might be that he wasn't necessarily a very celebrated or successful intelligence officer. Right. So how do you think it changes your worldview if you're formed by an organization in which you're not excelling versus if he had been excelling?
It's a good question. I think.
Until it's about psychology after 1991?
No. It's about how his psychology was defined, that he was not actually that successful inside of the KGB. No, he was not. Yeah, you're right. He wasn't extremely successful. He had some friends like Sergey Ivanov, who was much more successful. He was a KGB general, and Putin was just a colonel. I think the big problem for him was that he never. It's difficult to say in terms of his intelligence training, but usually it means that you get this provincial mentality. You don't actually understand how things. You don't understand the decision-making process. And also the problem was, you rightly pointed out, that he was not present in Berlin when the wall fell, and he was not present in Moscow when we got perestroika or we got 1991. It means that he saw these events from outside. He didn't understand a thing about freedom of press. He missed everything in Moscow. When he came back to Russia in the Soviet Union in 1990, he was struck by what he got. I mean, you left the country when everything was under strict government control, and you get back when you have freedom of press and everybody talking about Stalin's crimes and about Yeltsin, and he didn't understand this mechanism. And I think it was very unfortunate for Russian citizens, because it made him extremely. He didn't understand actually, and still doesn't understand what actually happened in 1991. And just imagine how important it is. You have the mighty Soviet Empire with this great, cherished by him, KGB, which was the most powerful, the most intelligence agency in the world. And all of a sudden it just, what, collapsed? How it could collapse? Why all these KGB people who actually, they claimed that they would protect the political regime until the last blood of until death, why they didn't do that? There should be some conspiracy here.
We discussed this many times, and we came to conclusion that Putin very often overreacted to the events and to the threats in the world, and that's and his overreaction partly or maybe mostly explained, but that he didn't understand why Soviet Union collapsed and what happened in 1991. He still believed that there was a conspiracy against the Soviet Union, and this conspiracy was organized by the Foreign Intelligence Service, mostly by the CIA. That's why he's so crazy about the United States, and he and his people and his close circle still believe that the CIA is the most powerful power in the world, and it's explained his overreaction to many things.
It's especially when you look, for instance, at the Moscow protests right now. Of course, normal people understand, but if you have the political stability in the country and you have all this regime, why not to let people, protest? And at the height of the protests, how many people we got? 60,000 people. It's nothing. We have 15 million people living only in Moscow. So it's a tiny bit of the population of the capital of the country. But he cannot let this happen because he doesn't know what could trigger the political change. It starts with what? With 100 people, 1,000 people, with 10,000 people? He doesn't know. That's why he always tries to suppress 100% of the street protests.
Can we fit in one last question?
Yeah, one last, please.
A quick question?
My question has to do with the journalists in Russia. You mentioned that, I think you said after Russia annexed Crimea, that a lot of journalists left at that point.
Yeah, that's right.
I would have assumed that journalists would leave Russia because they're afraid for their safety. But if they left at that point, is that the reason? And my second question is, do the two of you, you mentioned that your priest financier said, Andrei, you're endangered. Do the two of you feel that you're actually in danger?
People left after annexation in Crimea because the rules has changed and it's getting worse and worse every year. So, but I don't want to be so pessimistic because we have still a lot of independent liberal journalists and also many independent thinking people who are not afraid of expressing critics of the Kremlin. So. These journalists, they're still working and they are investigating. After annexation, before annexation of Crimea, we had before annexation of Crimea, we had just maybe several journalists, investigative journalists in Moscow, because investigation was extremely dangerous for journalists. But after annexation of Crimea, I don't know why, but for some reasons. We had several teams of independent investigative journalists who really exposed and is still exposing extremely important things. It's corruption, that's security services activities, that's what's going on in Russian regions. So let me be a little bit optimistic, because they're still doing something, and what they're doing is very important for the Russian audience. So not all of people, not all of journalists are frightened, not all of opposition politicians are. They're frightened to some extent, but it doesn't prevent them from continuing their activity and from opposing to the Kremlin.
Well, maybe on that optimistic note, we should thank our speakers.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And just so